When Richard Matthews smugly brought his girlfriend Ashley to their divorce hearing, he thought he'd outmaneuvered his wife, Elizabeth, to claim most of their assets. Unbeknownst to him, Elizabeth had built a hidden empire, secretly owning his prestigious law firm. In a stunning courtroom reveal, she exposed her power, flipping the dynamics and unraveling Richard's confidence. As the divorce unfolds, Elizabeth navigates personal betrayal and professional triumph, reclaiming her identity as a shrewd investor. This tale of revenge, empowerment, and revelation will leave you wondering, what secrets lie beneath the surface of your own relationships? Richard's grin flickered as he caught sight of me striding up the courthouse steps, his polished shoes planted beside Ashley's stilettos, her youthful smile a poor disguise for the smug triumph she thought she shared. The July sun glanced off the marble columns behind them, throwing long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me like greedy fingers eager for my downfall. But not today. 12 years of marriage unraveled behind my calm eyes as I approached. I could almost taste the bitterness of each lie he'd wrapped in silk excuses. Ashley clutched Richard's arm a little tighter when I drew near, her manicured nails digging crescents into his expensive suit. He straightened his tie, smirking at me the same way he had that morning the divorce papers arrived, delivered by a courier while he hid behind a fabricated business trip and another woman's perfume. Inside, the courthouse hummed with low conversation and the echo of hurried footsteps. Meredith Sloan walked beside me, her stride purposeful, her leather portfolio a loaded weapon that weighed far more than paper and ink. She glanced at me once, an unspoken question, and I gave a small, resolute nod. Today would be the reckoning. The hearing room was too bright, too cold for the poison that pulsed beneath the polite exchanges and thin smiles. Richard settled across the aisle, whispering to his junior associate, poor fool, so certain he was watching his mentor crush another opponent. Ashley lingered at the back, crossing her arms over her designer blouse, shifting from heel to heel. She had no idea her presence here would only sharpen the blade I'd been forging in silence. I sat with perfect posture, my navy suit absorbing the room's fluorescent chill. On my wrist, my grandmother's Cartier watch ticked softly, each second a reminder that this empire, this control, this carefully constructed fortress of secrets, was mine alone. When Judge Eleanor Harwood entered, the air shifted. Her gaze was iron, sweeping the room, resting on me longer than on Richard and his smug entourage. "All rise," the bailiff called, and we obeyed. I felt my pulse settle. Control is a quiet thing when wielded correctly. Richard's attorney began the ritual: petty grievances, claims of emotional neglect, the tired narrative of a husband wronged by a cold, inattentive wife. I studied Richard's profile as he feigned injury, chin tilted just so, voice smooth with fabricated regret. He might have fooled half this city, but not me. Not today. When Meredith stood, her voice sliced through his performance like a scalpel. She laid out the facts with surgical precision. Financial records, layered shell companies, silent partnerships, all leading back to me. The hum of whispers behind us rose like wind through dry leaves. Richard's expression twitched. First confusion, then disbelief. And then Judge Harwood turned to me directly. "Mrs. Matthews," she said, voice steady, eyes sharp as flint. "As the owner of Caldwell and Associates, do you wish to proceed with Mr. Matthews' legal representation?" Silence. For one exquisite heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath. Meredith glanced at me, lips curving in a whisper of a smile. Across the aisle, Richard's mouth parted, the color draining from his face as the truth hit him like a cold wave. I leaned forward, resting my hands atop the polished table, pearl earrings catching the harsh light. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear, each word deliberate, "I believe we have a conflict of interest. Wouldn't you agree?" Ashley's gasp cut the hush like a glass dropped on marble. Richard turned, eyes wide, mouth working soundlessly as the fortress he thought he'd built crumbled under the weight of what he'd never bothered to see. Me. Not the gracious hostess, not the invisible wife, the architect of his downfall. Outside the courtroom, the day remained bright and indifferent, but within these walls, the balance had shifted. Control, once his greatest weapon, now lay bleeding at my feet. And as Judge Harwood called for a brief recess, I caught Richard's gaze one last time, long enough for him to understand that his greatest miscalculation had never been about money. It had always been underestimating the woman who needed no one's permission to win. Richard's Audi pulled up to the curb with a purr so self-satisfied it might as well have announced him with a trumpet fanfare. Ashley unfolded herself from the passenger seat first, legs too long for decency in that cocktail dress masquerading as courtroom attire, her glossy blonde hair bouncing like she'd practiced the entrance. Richard emerged next, adjusting his silk tie, the edge of a smirk playing on lips that once murmured promises to me alone. I shrank into the shadow of a courthouse pillar, my pulse steady as Meredith, sharp-eyed and alert at my side, arched an eyebrow at my theatrics, but said nothing. She knew this was not the time to be seen. "That's them?" she murmured, her breath ghosting my ear as she peered around my shoulder. I didn't bother to answer aloud. Richard's hand slid, shameless, to the small of Ashley's back as he guided her up the steps. Proprietary, practiced. She looked up at him like he held the world in his palms. He didn't. I did. "She's 26, I said under my breath, letting the contempt sharpen every syllable. "A paralegal at Caldwell. He hired her last year." Meredith's lips curved into something cold and knowing. "Classic," she muttered, voice clipped as we waited for them to disappear through the courthouse doors before slipping in after. Inside, the stale air crackled with the hum of people teetering between hope and ruin. Attorneys pacing with files tucked under arms like weapons, anxious clients perched on benches, security guards herding the lost and the guilty. I caught sight of them near the marble directory. Richard leaning in close, his words coaxing a giggle from Ashley that grated at the edge of my teeth. Then his eyes snagged mine. His grin evaporated, a flicker of something ugly flitting across his carefully curated expression. I didn't flinch. I stepped forward, heels echoing on the polished floor like the strike of a gavel. "Richard," I said, my tone as smooth and cold as the granite pillars outside. He dipped his chin, a parody of courtesy. "Elizabeth." His gaze flicked to Meredith, eyes narrowing. "You brought counsel, I see." "As you have." I flicked my eyes to Marcus Weber, the shark in Caldwell's suit of armor. He stood solid beside Richard, impressive in stature, but his presence only confirmed Richard's unease. "An interesting choice," I mused aloud, letting my voice slide like silk over a blade. Bringing the senior partner to a divorce hearing that should have been so very, straightforward. Richard's jaw ticked, but Marcus stepped forward before he could bark out a retort. "Mrs. Matthews," Marcus began, voice lacquered in civility, "perhaps we could discuss a resolution privately before troubling Judge Harwood unnecessarily." "I'm sure you'd like that," I replied evenly, locking eyes with him until his smile strained at the edges. "But I think it's time we let the good judge see what we both have to say." Marcus's eyelid twitched, a subtle fracture in the mask. "As you wish." As we approached the courtroom, I saw Richard lean down, murmuring something into Ashley's ear. She nodded dutifully and perched herself on a bench, the perfect, obedient mistress, her eyes darting anywhere but at me. If I'd been a pettier woman, I might have thanked her for making my case so delightfully clear. Inside courtroom C, Meredith and I claimed our side like conquerors planting a flag. Richard and Marcus sat across, Richard's features schooled into unbothered composure, his hands folded, his tie straight, his posture impeccable. He looked like a man who had rehearsed his victory 1,000 times in the mirror. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Harwood." The room shifted to its feet as the judge entered, stern lines carved into her face like a mountain weathered by storms. Her steel-gray hair pulled back into an uncompromising knot, eyes sharp enough to peel skin from bone. We sat when she commanded it, the shuffle of papers and whispered instructions filling the silence she left in her wake. She flipped through the preliminary files, her glance flitting between Richard's smug calm and my poised stillness. 12 years of marriage, no children, significant shared assets, she recited, her voice a clean cut through the stale air. Mr. Matthews seeks 70% of the marital estate, arguing his career as the primary contributor to the couple's wealth. Is that correct, Mr. Weber? Marcus rose like a statue unfolding. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Matthews's partnership at Caldwell and Associates has generated the majority of the couple's assets. Judge Harwood's eyes pinned me like a moth to velvet. Mrs. Matthews, I understand you dispute this? I tipped my head toward Meredith. She stood without hesitation, unfolding a folder like a magician about to pull a live dove from her sleeve. Your Honor, not only do we dispute it, but we have evidence that will fundamentally reshape this court's understanding of Mr. Matthews' claim. I caught it then, a flicker of panic in Richard's carefully arranged facade, the crack I'd waited for. A year of our marriage's slow rot flashed before me, the late nights, the sudden business trips, the polite lies that soured on my tongue, and then Ashley, his predictable downfall in cheap perfume and tight skirts. He thought I'd been busy hosting dinners and smiling for his partners. What he never understood was that I'd been building something bigger than his fragile ego could fathom. My name, Elizabeth Winters, never appeared beside his on the firm's brass door, but it did sit on the hidden ledgers and layered shelves that made me the ghost owner of Caldwell and Associates. The irony might have been sweet if the betrayal hadn't soured it. When he delivered my divorce papers by courier, like an invoice for wasted years, I called Diane. And Diane reminded me who I was, not Richard's ornament, but the architect of an empire he hadn't the wit to see standing right under his nose. And today in this courtroom, under Judge Harwood's unflinching scrutiny, Richard Matthews was about to learn exactly whose empire it truly was. I felt a rush of cold resolve as Diane's words settled in the quiet of my kitchen. He's trying to screw you over, she had said, her bluntness a strange comfort amid the chaos. I merely nodded, letting a calm, steely hush settle over me like an armored cloak. But he has no idea who he's really up against. Diane's eyes glittered with a fierce amusement. Are you going to tell him about the firm? She asked, leaning forward as if she could taste the coming reckoning. Not yet, I murmured, my mind already stitching together the final seams of my plan. I'll wait until the moment he least expects it, when the exposure will cut deepest. Within days, I secured my own counsel, not from Richard's circle of loyal hounds, of course. Meredith Sloane came highly recommended, known for her keen mind and an iron composure that could unnerve the boldest opposing counsel. Together, we drafted our response to the divorce petition with all the expected indignation of a wronged, discarded wife. In court, I became what Richard thought I should be, demure, fragile, apparently bruised by betrayal. I wore muted grays and soft blues, lowered my gaze when appropriate, and offered the judge my gentlest voice. Richard studied me often with a kind of hungry confusion, as if he was waiting for my collapse to fortify his narrative. But all he saw was a woman contained, exactly as I intended. 2 months crawled by in a dance of motions, disclosures, and cold, strategic civility. I relinquished only what the law demanded, joint accounts, our home, the investments we'd agreed to share. But the labyrinth I'd woven behind veils of corporations and trusts stayed untouched, safely tucked behind the name he hadn't cared to remember. Elizabeth Winters. He never asked about it. Why would he? Well, to him, I was Mrs. Matthews, his convenient half, pliable and predictable. Then, at last, the email arrived. Our final hearing was set. I scrolled down the message, my breath catching when I read the judge's stipulation. All parties must be present. No proxies, no legal stand-ins. A slow smile unfurled on my lips as I pictured Richard's discomfort, stripped of the fortress of his legal entourage. And if my whispers from Clara Mason proved true, Ashley, his bright-eyed, barely trained paralegal turned lover, would be waiting just beyond the courtroom doors, a pathetic monument to his imagined triumph. But Richard had no inkling of the real monument I'd prepared. When the day came, the courtroom felt unusually small, every marble tile and polished bench echoing with secrets. Meredith rose as Judge Eleanor Harwood called us to order. She glanced at me once, then began, her voice crisp as the click of her heels. Your Honor, she said, sliding a folder across the table, we wish to submit additional evidence detailing Mrs. Matthews' independent financial holdings throughout the marriage. A hush draped the courtroom as the bailiff delivered copies to Judge Harwood, Marcus Weber, Caldwell and Associates senior partner, and finally Richard himself. I watched the paper land in Marcus's hands, his brow furrowed, then smoothed, then pinched again as the numbers bloomed before him. Richard leaned in, hungry for confirmation. His eyes flicked across the pages, curiosity melting to bewilderment, then horror. As you can see, Meredith continued, her tone mercilessly polite, Miss Matthews has, under her maiden name, Elizabeth Winters, sustained extensive real estate holdings, diversified investments, and, most notably, majority ownership of Winters Holdings LLC, which acquired controlling interest in Caldwell and Associates 9 years ago. The words hit the courtroom like a stray gust in a cathedral. Marcus's finger paused mid-line, rigid in the air. He turned to Richard with the blank, stunned dread of a man realizing his empire was built on borrowed sand. "That's impossible," Richard rasped. His voice cracked at the edge, betraying the raw edge of his disbelief. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. "Elizabeth, is this true?" I held his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Yes, Richard," I said, my voice soft but sharp enough to cut. "It's true." Judge Harwood's cool voice sliced through the silence. "Mr. Weber, were you aware of this arrangement?" Marcus's throat bobbed. He turned another page, trying to find an escape route buried in the ink. "No, Your Honor," he stammered. "This was never disclosed to the partnership." Meredith didn't blink. "It was disclosed to the parent company's board," she countered smoothly, "in full compliance with the law. The daily operations team was not required to be notified of controlling interest unless a conflict arose." Richard lurched to his feet, his chair shrieking against the floor like an alarm. "This changes everything," he barked at Marcus, voice raw with disbelief. "We need to regroup." "Sit down, Mr. Matthews," Judge Harwood ordered sharply. "We are not finished." Richard sank back, but I could see the tremor in his hands as he grasped the edge of the table. 12 years of marriage, yet only now did he understand who sat across from him. "Your Honor," Meredith pressed on, her tone calm as a blade. "Given this information, Mr. Matthews' claim that his career was the principal source of the couple's wealth is demonstrably false. Mrs. Matthews' investments and holdings have significantly exceeded Mr. Matthews' contributions during the marriage." Judge Harwood leafed through the documents with surgical focus. "These are substantial revelations, Mrs. Matthews. Why weren't they presented in your initial declaration?" I straightened my shoulders. "They were disclosed, Your Honor. My personal financial statement included them, as required. Separate documentation exists for the business interests. Meredith can produce the entire trail if necessary." The judge's eyes flicked to Marcus and Richard. "Counsel, do you require time to review this new evidence?" Marcus, pale but fighting for composure, cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. We request a brief recess to confer." "Granted," Judge Harwood said. 30 minutes. When we return, I expect an honest discussion of the division of assets, grounded in the facts now before us." As the judge rose and the bailiff called for recess, Richard remained motionless, eyes glazed, mouth slightly parted. Marcus leaned in, whispering frantic calculations. But Richard didn't hear him. His kingdom was ash in his hands. I rose, smoothing the fabric of my skirt, feeling the weight lift from my chest like a window cracked open in a stale room. All these years I'd waited for this single moment, for the mask to drop, for him to see the woman he'd never truly known. He jolted awake just as I gathered my things. He blocked my path with a trembling hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" he hissed, the words hot and desperate. I met his eyes, my voice a quiet, lethal echo. "Would it have changed anything, Richard? Would you have seen me differently, your wife, your silent partner, if you'd known I was your employer all along?" "Of course it would have mattered," he snapped. His eyes darted to the doors, to where Ashley waited, oblivious to the ruins crumbling inside. This is humiliating." I tilted my head, studying the man I'd once loved. "Humiliating," I repeated, my voice silk over steel. "Like bringing your girlfriend to our divorce hearing?" His cheeks flamed. For a heartbeat, he opened his mouth, then shut it again. He had no answer worth hearing. I brushed past him, Meredith at my side, the corridor yawning open ahead like a promise. The rest of my life, finally mine alone. "You're grasping at 70% of our assets based on that bloated ego of yours, Richard?" I said, my tone cool enough to frost the air between us. Marcus Weber materialized at his side like an anxious shadow, his hands settling on Richard's arm in a quiet command. "Richard, this isn't the place," Marcus murmured, his voice barely above the hush of the courtroom's ambient murmurs. I stepped closer, my heels clicking softly on the polished floor, a sound that seemed to echo in Richard's reddening ears. Leaning in, I spoke low enough for only him to catch every syllable. By the way, Ashley's still waiting outside. Someone ought to break it to her that her gallant boyfriend's just realized he's been sleeping with the boss's wife all along. The blood drained from Richard's face so completely I half expected him to faint right there, under the judge's solemn gaze. Without a word, he spun on his heel and strode out, Marcus scrambling to keep up with his retreating figure. Meredith Sloane arched one elegantly skeptical eyebrow as she watched them vanish through the heavy oak doors. Well, that unraveled exactly as we predicted. Indeed, I said, gathering my purse with deliberate calm, though a storm of 12 suffocating years began to lift from my chest with each breath. But this is far from over. As Meredith and I stepped into the corridor's sterile fluorescence, my eyes found them. Richard standing rigid before Ashley, who was all confusion, then dawning horror, then mortification. She caught my steady stare, her cheeks flushing as she averted her eyes to the cold tile floor. "What now?" Meredith asked, her voice low as we moved past the courthouse buzz toward a consultation room tucked away from curious ears. "Now," I exhaled, savoring the sudden lightness in my lungs. "We negotiate. But this time we negotiate on my terms." Inside the small room, the door clicked shut behind us, shutting out the echo of Richard's muffled excuses and Ashley's escalating indignation. Through the narrow pane of glass, I glimpsed her hands flying in frantic gestures, her lips forming sharp questions Richard was too flustered to answer. "He's scrambling to contain the fallout," Meredith remarked, observing the scene with a lawyer's practiced detachment. "Personally and professionally, Marcus is probably spelling it out for him even now. His little affair wasn't just messy, it's career poison. Sleeping with the boss's wife, hardly a stepping stone to senior partner." I laughed softly, sitting across from her at the small table. Riley Richard, always so smug about my lack of interest in his work. If only he'd known. Meredith opened her folder, eyes narrowing in focus. "We need to chart your next move regarding Caldwell and Associates. Your controlling interest puts you in a position of power, not just in this divorce, but in Richard's entire future." I drummed my fingers against the table's smooth veneer, letting the weight of her words sink in all my calculated planning. The reveal, the cold dismantling of Richard's double life. I hadn't truly paused to consider the pieces I'd now hold. "I never planned to interfere with the firm," I admitted, my voice thoughtful, almost distant. "It was purely an investment. The partners run it well, profits climb every year, but now—" Meredith leaned forward, the gleam in her eyes sharp as polished steel. "Now your silent stake isn't so silent anymore. And you have a partner who's about to learn how humiliating it is to realize his wife's been his boss all along." A vibration on the table drew my gaze, my phone blinking with a message from Diane. "How's it going? Dropped the bomb yet?" I typed back quickly, "Yes, courtroom's in recess." His face was worth every penny. "You know," Meredith continued, lips curling in wry amusement, "Richard will claim he built your fortune alongside you. That Caldwell's success fed your wealth." I set my phone aside unbothered. "Let him. The controlling shares were mine before he made partner. I used my family trust, my investments, every cent accounted for, every document meticulously filed. He can huff and puff all he wants." Meredith gave a small, approving nod. "Good, he's going to be desperate now. Men like Richard can't stomach being publicly gutted." A soft knock interrupted the calm. Marcus stepped in alone, his tie askew, hair slightly mussed, a man stripped of his usual lawyerly armor. He closed the door with careful precision, then sank into the chair opposite me, every one of his 62 years etched in the lines around his eyes. "In all my years," he began, voice hoarse with a lawyer's weary truth, "I have never been blindsided like this." I folded my hands neatly on the table. "It wasn't hidden, Marcus. The board could have connected the dots. It's hardly my fault they never bothered to see that Elizabeth Winters was also Elizabeth Matthews." His sigh was an exhale of grudging respect and buried frustration. Why keep Richard in the dark for so long? What was the point? The question was a blade that pressed gently at old wounds. When I invested, we were only 3 years married. He was ambitious, burning to prove himself. I didn't want my money overshadowing him, didn't want him to feel small in his own career. So I kept my world separate. And over time, it just stayed that way, easier than unearthing it all. And now, Marcus's gaze tightened, leaning forward, as if he could coax the future from my lips. What do you intend to do with that controlling interest now that the curtain's up? That depends, I said slowly, meeting his stare without a flicker. On Richard, and on you, Marcus. His brow furrowed. Me? You're the managing partner. You shape the culture of Caldwell and Associates. How you steer this storm, how you handle Richard, will shape what I do next. He digested that, shoulders sagging as the reality settled in. Richard wants a settlement conference rather than dragging this out in open court. He's proposing a 50-50 split of all marital assets and says he'll walk away from any claim to your business holdings. A laugh slipped out, sharp and humorless. How generous, offering me half of what's already mine. Marcus's fingers drummed the table, restless. Elizabeth, he made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but he's still an asset to this firm. I'm imploring you to weigh what's best for everyone before burning this place to the ground. I studied him, really studied him. The lines of fear there weren't just for Richard, but for every partner who'd unknowingly danced under my quiet watch for nearly a decade. I don't intend to dismantle Caldwell, Marcus, I said, my voice calm but edged with iron. My money was always meant to work quietly behind the scenes. Our divorce doesn't change that. Relief flickered in his eyes, but I raised a hand, halting him. However, I let the word hang, heavy and final. I expect the firm to handle this divorce with the same integrity it claims to uphold in every case it fights. No hidden assets, no courtroom theatrics, no backroom games, a clean break, a fair split. And Richard walks away with exactly what he's earned. No more, no less. Marcus's nod came sharp, obedient, a silent contract sealed between two seasoned tacticians. Full financial disclosure from both sides, I reminded him coolly, my voice acquiring a steel edge as I added. And one more thing, Richard's liaison with Ashley, I savored the deliberate pause, is a liability for this firm. I trust you'll handle it discreetly. Marcus adjusted his tie, a flicker of discomfort betraying the calm facade. I'll speak with Richard about the settlement proposal. There's still time before the recess ends. As his hand grazed the polished brass doorknob, I stopped him with a crisp, Marcus, send Ashley in when you're done. I'd like a word. Moments later, Ashley slipped through the door like a child summoned for reprimand. She stood awkwardly near the threshold, her gaze skipping across the floor, walls, anywhere but me. The brittle self-assurance she wielded like cheap perfume was gone, leaving only a sheen of fear. Mrs. Matthews. Her voice was so faint it barely existed. Marcus said you wanted. Sit. I gestured to the chair opposite mine, ignoring her faltering tone. And do call me Elizabeth. After all, I let the silence drag, watching the panic flicker behind her mascaraed lashes. You've been sleeping with my husband for 8 months. I think we're well beyond pleasantries. Ashley flinched, finally forcing her eyes to mine. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, sir, I said, voice smooth as glass. I didn't ask you here for an apology. I want to clear up a few misunderstandings, for your sake as much as mine. She lowered herself onto the edge of the chair, body taut as if ready to spring away at the first chance. Up close, she looked even younger than I'd guessed, 24, 25 at most. Her hair was artfully sun-kissed, her makeup delicately contrived to appear effortless, a fresh, fleeting beauty that women my age envy and pity in equal measure. First, I began, folding my hands atop my files. Understand this, my marriage was already rotting when you arrived. You didn't break anything that wasn't cracked long before. Relief flickered across her delicate features, swiftly chased by suspicion. Then, why tell me this? She asked, her voice steadier now, sharpened by wounded pride. Because, I replied evenly, I don't want you to cling to illusions. Richard didn't abandon our life for a grand romance. He left because you were convenient when I became inconvenient. Her cheeks pinked under perfectly blended blush. You don't know anything about us. Oh, Ashley. I leaned in just enough for her to smell the expensive perfume I'd chosen precisely to remind her who she was up against. I know Richard better than you ever will. 14 years of knowing, 12 years of marriage. His patterns are as familiar to me as my own reflection. When life borrows him, when complications arise, he finds a distraction. Once it was you. She blinked hard, processing. He said you were cold, distant, that you resented his ambition. I smiled, a small, pitying thing. He whispered the same script to the woman before you. He was engaged to her. Did you know that? Did he paint their ending as mutual, civil, necessary? Her lips parted, a tiny gasp betraying her shock. He said they grew apart. I gave a low, mirthless laugh. He called it mutual. That's generous considering she found him tangled in bedsheets with me. I tilted my head, watching her throat work as she swallowed. Do you see the pattern now? Ashley stared at her manicured hands, nails immaculate but trembling. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Because you deserve to know the man you believe you love, I said, my tone softening. And because your career is now a delicate problem. You're a paralegal, sleeping with your married supervisor, a senior partner, no less. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. Panic flared in her wide eyes. Are you going to fire me? I shook my head, amused despite myself. I don't handle personnel, but the partners will have to act now. At the very least, you'll be reassigned, far from Richard's oversight. She stiffened, chin tilting up in a child's show of defiance. Richard said we'd keep working together, he promised. Ah, promises, I murmured, allowing myself a wry smile. Richard is quite the virtuoso with those. He promises what you want until what you want threatens what he needs. A crack appeared in her certainty, a fine fracture spreading under the weight of unwelcome truth. I pressed gently. Think on this, Ashley. Richard's entire career is built on devouring wives like me. Smart men outfoxing women who think they have leverage. Now he's the cornered prey. The irony won't be lost on anyone. Ashley bit her lip, the bright polish on her teeth almost cartoonish against her pallor. His reputation, he'll lose it. Not just his reputation, I corrected, his mask. The persona that fools the court, the clients, perhaps even you. How he navigates this will reveal who he truly is, and trust me, he will not go down gracefully. She whispered, why do you even care what happens to me? You should hate me. Hate? I tasted the word, let it roll off my tongue like stale wine. Hate costs energy I prefer to spend wisely. I don't want to ruin Richard. I want him to taste every consequence he's sidestepped for years. Ashley's eyes dropped to her lap again, shoulders slumping under the weight of my certainty. When she looked up at last, there was a flicker of something new. Awareness, perhaps, or the first spark of self-preservation. I didn't know, she said, her voice almost childlike. About the firm, the engagement. He always said you were cold, obsessed with your company. I let out a quiet, rueful laugh. Funny thing is, he never even asked what my work really was. A soft knock jarred the moment. Judge Eleanor Harwood's bailiff, reminding us court would reconvene in 5 minutes. Ashley rose, her steps uncertain. She hesitated at the door. Elizabeth, what should I do now? That's not my decision to make, I said, my voice clear, even kind. But if you have any sense left, watch him closely today. Power shifts reveal true character. See who Richard Matthews really is when the tables turn. When she was gone, the door clicked shut behind her like a final punctuation mark on a chapter I was rewriting in real time. I drew in a steady breath, tasting the strange bittersweetness of reclaimed power. The battle wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time in months, I could see the shape of the war ahead. And this time, the story would belong to me. Richard's eyes refused to meet mine as the bailiff's sharp voice sliced through the heavy hush. All rise! The scrape of chairs echoed like a warning shot as Judge Eleanor Harwood swept back into the courtroom. her black robe carrying the chill of authority that made even the most hardened attorneys shift in their seats. I scanned the rows behind Richard, but found no sign of Ashley. His eager little shadow conveniently vanished. The judge settled behind the bench, her lined face unreadable as her eyes flicked between our tables. I understand both parties have reviewed new disclosures. Where do we stand? Her voice, steady as granite, filled every corner of the room. Marcus Weber rose, smoothing his tie as though polishing tarnish from his client's reputation. Your Honor, in light of Mrs. Matthews' recent financial disclosures, we wish to propose a settlement agreement rather than pursue the contested hearing. One of Judge Harwood's sharp brows arched, a subtle but lethal gesture. A remarkable shift, Mr. Weber. Marcus dipped his head respectfully. Yes, Your Honor. Upon reviewing Mrs. Matthews' documentation, it became clear that Mr. Matthews' initial position on asset division was misguided. Across from him, Richard's jaw ticked, a tiny betrayal of his tightly rehearsed stoicism. The judge's attention pivoted toward us. Miss Sloan, Mrs. Matthews' response? Meredith Sloan rose beside me, all clean lines and iron composure. Mrs. Matthews is amenable to a fair settlement, Your Honor, so long as it honors the integrity of her separate holdings and equitably divides the true marital estate. A moment of silence pulsed like a held breath before Judge Harwood inclined her head. Very well. Do the parties wish to continue these discussions privately, or shall the court remain engaged? Marcus caught Meredith's eye. They traded a look thick with the calculus of hidden traps. Meredith spoke first, her voice clear as crystal. Given the complexity of Ms. Matthews' business assets, we believe the court's oversight remains prudent until we establish preliminary terms. Marcus added his assent so swiftly it almost stumbled from his lips. I recognized the flicker of caution in his eyes. He knew too well I might have other revelations tucked away, waiting for the right crack to slip through. Proceed, Judge Harwood ordered crisply. Mr. Weber, outline your client's terms. Marcus cleared his throat, folding his hands in front of him like a penitent man begging leniency. Mr. Matthews concedes that Mrs. Matthews' business interests, including her ownership stake in Caldwell and Associates, constitute separate property and are therefore excluded from division. He agrees to an equal split of the marital assets accrued over their 12-year marriage. Judge Harwood's gaze landed on Richard. His nod was mechanical, his stare anchored to a scuff mark on the polished table. Marcus pushed on, his tone measured. Additionally, Mr. Matthews withdraws prior assertions that his career was the primary generator of the couple's wealth and acknowledges Mrs. Matthews' substantial financial contributions. A muscle twitched at Richard's temple, just enough for me to see the bruise his pride was nursing. Judge Harwood jotted a note, then gestured toward Meredith. Ms. Sloan? Meredith rose again, her presence a calm force at my side. Mrs. Matthews accepts the recognition of her separate property and the equal division of marital assets. However, we seek clarity on specific items. The family home, Mrs. Matthews proposes its sale and an equal split of the proceeds. Richard's retirement accounts, which should be divided equitably as marital property, and a number of personal items with significant sentimental value to Mrs. Matthews. As she spoke, I could feel Richard's silence grow heavier. Swallowing his earlier bravado whole, he stared straight ahead, but once, just once, his eyes flicked to mine. Beneath the resentment lay a shadow of something softer. Regret, perhaps, or merely the echo of a man realizing how thoroughly he'd misplayed his hand. Meredith's closing words fell like the click of a lock. Judge Harwood glanced over the papers, then back at Richard. These terms appear balanced and feasible. I believe we can resolve this today. Mr. Matthews, you've been unusually quiet. Do you wish to add anything before I instruct my clerk to draft the agreement? The courtroom hushed around the brittle sound of Richard pushing back his chair. He rose with the strained elegance of a man who'd practiced this performance in the bathroom mirror, but found the real stage far less forgiving. Your Honor, he began, his voice brittle but unwavering. I accept the settlement as described. However, I wish to address one final matter. The judge gestured for him to continue. Richard turned then, shoulders stiff, hands clenched at his sides, until he met my gaze fully for the first time in months. The courtroom walls seemed to lean closer. I wish to offer a formal apology to Mrs. Matthews for my conduct during the final years of our marriage, and for the combative stance I adopted in these proceedings. His throat bobbed with a dry swallow as he forced the words through teeth long used to biting back the truth. My actions were unprofessional and disrespectful. Elizabeth deserved far better, as my wife, and he hesitated, the tiniest crack in his mask, as my business partner. That single word, partner, carried more weight than all his lawyerly protests ever had. I know an apology changes nothing, he continued, voice low but clear. But I want the record to reflect that I recognize my failings. For the first time that morning, Judge Harwood's features softened, if only by a degree. Thank you, Mr. Matthews. Your statement is duly noted. Her gaze shifted to me. Mrs. Matthews? Every pair of eyes turned. I stood slowly, letting the hush stretch until the knot in my throat loosened just enough to let my reply pass cleanly. The apology, raw and unrehearsed, was not the shield I had expected him to wield. I appreciate Mr. Matthews' apology, Your Honor, and I accept it in the spirit it's offered. I paused, letting my next words carry the quiet authority I had rebuilt piece by piece. For the record, my ownership in Caldwell and Associates has never been, nor will it ever be, a tool to interfere with its operations or the careers of its partners, Richard included. The separation of personal and professional spheres has always been paramount to me, and it remains so. Relief washed across Marcus's face like a man spared the gallows. Richard's shoulders sagged a fraction, some unspoken weight finally uncoiling. With this understanding, I concluded, I believe we can conclude our divorce with civility and preserve the boundaries that protect the firm and everyone within it. Judge Harwood gave a single approving nod. Very well stated, Mrs. Matthews. She regarded both tables, her gavel still at rest. I'm directing counsel to work with my clerk to prepare the final documents. We will reconvene in 1 hour to finalize this agreement. She rose, robe sweeping behind her like a closing curtain. Court is in recess. As the door clicked shut behind her, Richard drifted toward our table, leaving Marcus rooted behind him. He stopped just out of arm's reach, his voice softer than the echo of his footsteps. Elizabeth, he murmured, eyes locked on mine, with the brittle honesty of a man half hoping for forgiveness, half bracing for its refusal. Could we speak, just the two of us, for a moment? I glanced at Meredith, who gave a single, sharp nod. Permission, protection, and warning all in one. I turned back to Richard, breath steady, spine straight. 5 minutes, I thought, that's all you get. A cold hush lingered in the hallway as I stepped back from Richard, folding my arms against the chill seeping through the courthouse's marble walls. We drifted from the courtroom's heavy air, finding an unused alcove where our words wouldn't echo back at us through gossiping clerks and watchful rivals. He looked smaller here, stripped of the courtroom's armor, no longer the strutting, self-assured divorce shark, but a man uncertain of his footing. Where's Ashley? I asked, flicking my gaze at the empty bench where she'd perched earlier, all doe-eyed concern and silent smugness. A flicker of embarrassment tugged at Richard's mouth. She left. We thought it best. I raised an eyebrow, unwilling to grant him the mercy of my curiosity. Whatever petty theater had played out between them during recess was of no consequence to me now. Your apology back there, I said instead, letting the words settle between us like dust motes in a sunbeam. Marcus's handiwork? His jaw twitched, a ghost of his old defiance. No, hard as it is to believe, I do know when I've been an ass. 12 years of marriage would suggest otherwise. I bit back any real venom, letting the words drift out softer than he deserved. He exhaled sharply, fingers combing through hair that had cost him more vanity than honesty ever had. The gesture seemed oddly naked, an admission he'd never speak aloud. I deserved that. Silence stretched between us, thick with years that refused to stay buried. 12 years. The villa in Santorini where we drank too much wine and made promises that turned to shadows. The spring in Paris when we pretended we were better than we were. The miscarriage that neither of us knew how to grieve, so we simply didn't. And then the slow, corrosive drift of two people sharing a roof, but not a life, speaking only in errands and obligations, never in truths. Why didn't you tell me? His voice, suddenly hoarse, startled me more than the question itself. About the firm, about everything. Why keep it hidden? The answers I'd rehearsed for weeks sat ready on my tongue, polished, convenient half-truths. But standing here, his regret pulling at old seams, I found myself grasping for something rawer, truer. At first, I said, tasting each word as if it might betray me, I didn't want to eclipse you. You were so proud, becoming associate, clawing your way toward partner. I thought if you knew your wife already owned Caldwell and Associates, it would cheapen what you'd done. A flicker of surprise, almost tenderness, softened his sharp features, but it faded as quickly as it came. And later? I let out a breath, my arms dropping to my sides. Later, it was just the way things were. The longer I stayed silent, the more impossible it felt to bring it up. And honestly, Richard, I wondered if you'd even care. His brow creased. What do you mean? When was the last time you asked about my day, my interests, anything that didn't orbit around you and your victories? The question stung more than I expected. My own confession threaded through the accusation. You stopped seeing me years ago. I became a fixture, someone to host your dinners, polish your reputation, pretend I didn't know about the late nights and the secrets. He opened his mouth to deflect, to deny, but thought better of it. For once, he let the truth stand between us, unchallenged. I didn't know how to tell you, I said softly, my throat tight, that the silent wife you saw as convenient was, in fact, a woman who built something entirely her own. How do you say that without it sounding like blame? Richard leaned back against the wall, weariness settling into his bones. I really thought you liked it, being looked after. I almost laughed, sharp, humorless, because it was easier than asking what I actually wanted, just like it was easier to find Ashley than fix what you'd broken. At her name, he flinched. That was a mistake. The affair, or dragging her to our hearing like a prop? I asked, tilting my head. He winced again. Good. Let it sting. Both, he admitted, voice low. Bringing her was childish. I wanted to prove I'd moved on, that I didn't need you. And how's that working out for you, Dion? I asked, a ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. His answering laugh was dry, edged with something like shame. About as well as you'd expect. He straightened, fixing me with a look that was almost unfamiliar in its sincerity. For what it's worth, Elizabeth, I am sorry. About Ashley, about everything, for never really seeing you. It landed heavier than I'd anticipated. Richard Matthews, apologizing without condition or excuse. How novel. Part of me wanted to hold on to it, to savor this rare glimpse of humility, but a deeper part knew it was nothing more than an ending, well overdue. I appreciate that, I said quietly. He hesitated, the unspoken question pressed between us until he gave it voice. And now, the firm, my place there? Of course, the heart of it. For all his contrition, Richard's real love had always been his career. I couldn't fault him for that. It was the one truth between us that had never lied. That depends on you, I said evenly. My stake in Caldwell was always an investment. I won't interfere in the daily running. Marcus and Patricia have my trust. Relief softened the tight lines around his mouth. So, my position is safe. I didn't smile. Your position is only as secure as your value to the firm. Marcus thinks highly of your legal mind, if not your judgment. He absorbed that without protest, nodding slowly. And Marcus stays as managing partner? As I said in court, unless I'm given reason to think otherwise. The warning was quiet but unmistakable. He caught it. Richard always did understand subtext when his own interests were at stake. And us, he asked almost gently, what are we now? I let the question settle before answering. Professionally, we respect the lines. You work. I invest. We speak when absolutely necessary. I drew in a breath. Personally, Richard, we're finished. Not because of Ashley, because we stopped being partners long before her. We stopped seeing each other long before she ever sat at your desk. To my surprise, he didn't argue. He only nodded, the final truth landing with a muted thud between us. For what it's worth, he murmured, I did love you, Elizabeth. In my way. I met his eyes steady. I know. And I loved you too. But love without respect is just a promise that rots. A clerk's brisk footsteps broke the moment. Miss Matthews, Miss Sloan and Mr. Weber are ready to finalize the agreement. I turned to leave. Richard's voice caught me one last time. Did you plan this? Revealing your stake? Was it part of your strategy? I allowed myself a small, unguarded smile. No, I meant to let you have your divorce your way. Simple, clean, but you forced my hand. The accusations in your filing. Ashley on that bench, trying to claim 70% because you believed I was just the dutiful wife. He shook his head, a rueful, almost admiring look flickering there. God, Elizabeth, I never really knew you at all. I brushed past him, my steps carrying me back toward the life I'd built in the shadows, no longer hidden. No, Richard, you didn't. A flicker of disbelief cut across Richard's face, a ghost of his former smugness, now outmatched by the truth I'd laid bare. I should have known better than to underestimate you, he muttered, the corners of his mouth lifting in a grim, self-deprecating smile. Yes, I agreed as we reached the heavy courtroom doors. You should have. For the first time that day, Richard laughed, a short, honest sound that held the weight of a man cornered by his own illusions. Well played, Elizabeth. Well played. His words lingered as we returned to our respective counsel. I caught Meredith Sloane's quick, knowing glance, her pen poised above the settlement draft. At that moment, an unexpected sense of release settled over me, like stepping from a locked room into fresh, biting air. This was never how I'd pictured our marriage would close when we exchanged vows 12 years ago under a flowering arch and whispered promises we barely understood. Yet here we were, two people finally stripped to the raw truth of who we were together and, more importantly, apart. The next hours dissolved into a blur of clauses, figures, and signatures. Meredith, sharp as ever, conferred in low tones with Marcus Weber, who methodically adjusted every line to shield my holdings. Across the polished mahogany table, Richard perched stiffly at the opposite end, conferring with his attorney in clipped, resigned murmurs. Occasionally, we'd break the silence with dry clarifications about property lines, account balances, the art he'd never cared to notice until now. By late afternoon, the final draft lay before us, thick with mutual concessions. I retained every inch of my hidden empire, Caldwell and Associates, my silent stakes, the entire intricate lattice I'd spent years weaving beneath Richard's nose, the house, the mutual funds, the gallery pieces, even Richard's hard-earned retirement. These we divided with surgical fairness. The house would sell, the proceeds split cleanly down the center. No alimony. Neither of us wanted tethered obligations. We were both far too proud for that. As Judge Eleanor Harwood retreated to examine our final accord, I slipped out into the courthouse corridor, the stale chill of institutional air brushing my skin. I found a worn bench beneath a framed portrait of some long-dead justice and dialed Diane. She picked up on the second ring. So, it's done? Her voice blunt and bracing as always. Almost, I murmured, leaning back, watching a bailiff stride past with a file tucked under his arm. The judge is reviewing everything now. And Richard? Diane pressed. How'd he take your grand reveal? I allowed myself a thin, private smile at the memory of his face when Meredith slid those sealed ownership documents across the table. About as well as you'd imagine. Shock first, then the scramble to salvage what he could. He's been surprisingly cooperative since. Diane let out a sharp laugh tinged with disbelief. Richard Matthews cooperative? The man doesn't lift a finger unless there's leverage in it for him. There is, I admitted, my gaze drifting to a pair of junior clerks whispering conspiratorially by the elevators. I'm not ousting him from Caldwell and Associates. That was his real fear once he saw the truth. Of course it was. Diane's scoff cut through the phone. His precious career has always come first. It did. A shard of something lodged in my chest, not grief exactly. A ghost of nostalgia for the version of us that never existed. So did mine. Just not the way he ever understood. Silence hummed between us. Then, softly, "Are you really okay, Liz?" Diane asked, her bluntness momentarily gentled. Honestly, the question hit me sideways. For months, I'd armored myself in strategy and secrets, learning of Ashley, unearthing bank statements, crafting the perfect moment to pull the rug from under him. But the shield had cracked. "I think I am," I said, the words tasting new and strange on my tongue. Not how I thought I'd feel, but yes, it's a relief in its own strange way. No more pretending, no more shadows. And Ashley? Diane's tone turned acid, curiosity sharpened by loyalty. Did the girlfriend scurry in behind him today? She did. I could still see Ashley's pale, startled face that morning when the first documents were read into record, how the facade Richard had spun for her unraveled in seconds. She sat in the gallery, lost. We spoke during the recess. You spoke to her? Diane's bark of disbelief made me chuckle for the first time that day. I told her the truth, that Richard is consistent, if nothing else, that patterns don't change overnight, no matter how he dresses them up. I paused, remembering Ashley's hollow nod, her eyes darting to where Richard pretended not to watch. She was young, too young to see it coming. He told her I was cold, obsessed with work, neglectful, which is the irony, isn't it? The irony being, Diane broke in, her laughter warming, that you were career-obsessed, just not in the way he assumed. Exactly. A dry laugh escaped me. If he'd paid real attention, he might have discovered we were more alike than he ever guessed. The bailiff's shadow fell across me, a polite interruption. Judge Harwood was ready. I ended the call with a promise to Diane for dinner soon, somewhere far from conference rooms and witness stands. Inside, the courtroom now felt less like an arena and more like a sterile stage. Judge Harwood adjusted her glasses, scanning our signatures. "I find the terms reasonable and equitable," she declared, her voice the gavel's echo. "Does either party wish to speak before I finalize?" Richard and I exchanged one last look. Nothing left to say. We shook our heads. "Very well." Her pen glided across the page, swift and final. "This agreement is now incorporated into your divorce decree. Upon filing with the clerk, your marriage is legally dissolved." And so 12 years vanished. No confessions, no scenes, just ink binding a new reality. As we gathered our folders, Marcus approached, extending a hand firm with fresh allegiance. "Elizabeth, I trust we can meet next week to discuss the quarterly forecasts." His eyes held the subtle gleam of someone recalibrating his loyalties. "Of course, Marcus." I took his handshake, steady. "Have your assistant coordinate with mine." When Marcus turned away, Richard stepped forward, voice lowered to keep our ghost private. "So," he murmured, a trace of rueful wonder in his tone, "it seems I've been working for my wife all these years without ever knowing it." "Ex-wife," I corrected, soft but immovable. A flicker, regret, surrender moved behind his eyes. "Ex-wife," he echoed, "though still my boss, apparently." "Technically," I amended, slipping my bag over my shoulder, "I'm a major stakeholder. But I suppose the distinction feels academic from where you stand." Richard huffed a brittle laugh, shaking his head. "All this time, I thought I was the clever one." "You were clever," I said, "because it was true in its sad, limited way. Just not quite observant enough." He accepted that like a sentence passed down by a fair judge. No appeal left. "What will you do now that the world knows who you really are?" he asked. It was the right question. The one I'd been carrying with me into this new, unhidden life. For years, I'd been two women. Elizabeth Matthews, dutiful wife. Elizabeth Winters, cunning architect of her own quiet empire. Now, with the last page signed, they were one and the same. He extended his hand, cool, dry, and final. I clasped it without hesitation, feeling the subtle tremor of an ending turned beginning. "Good luck, Elizabeth. I mean that." Richard's eyes searched mine for a flicker of regret he would never find. "You too, Richard." The handshake lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, a ceremonial severing of 12 constricted years. I watched him retreat down the marble hallway, his shoulders squared but somehow diminished. And within that silence, a strange buoyant hush filled my chest. It was as if I'd set down a crate of secrets so heavy I'd forgotten I was carrying it. For over a decade, I had diluted my brilliance, hidden the architecture of my own empire behind a name borrowed from a marriage already in ruins. That pretense was dust now. Tomorrow, no, today, belonged solely to me. I woke in the hush of the presidential suite at the Four Seasons, cocooned by crisp linen and an unfamiliar calm that felt both earned and foreign. I didn't hurry to reclaim the house that was now wholly mine. Instead, I stood before floor-to-ceiling glass, coffee warm in my palm, eyes roaming the skyline where dawn unspooled in golden ribbons between towers of glass and steel. My phone pulsed ceaselessly on the low marble table, a restless insect of consequence. Every vibration carried the chatter of boardrooms, the gossip of the financial press, the greedy curiosity of strangers sniffing scandal. Elizabeth Winters, the elusive patron behind strategic takeovers, was overnight unmasked as Elizabeth Matthews, soon to be ex-wife of Richard Matthews, the same Richard who'd built his reputation under the roof I secretly owned. It made a delicious headline: "Wife owns husband's firm," a neat scandal to pass around over overpriced cocktails. But beneath the cheap thrill lay a truth far less tawdry, far more unassailable. I had built, acquired, and protected my holdings with a discipline no gossip rag could distort, and I would guard that truth as fiercely as I had hidden it. I thumbed James Sullivan's number and braced myself. He answered with that measured calm that made him invaluable. "The financial press is in a frenzy," he said, skipping pleasantries. "The Journal wants a quote. Bloomberg, too." "No interviews," I said, my voice iron smooth. "Draft a statement, concise but immovable. Confirm my ownership, emphasize stability at Caldwell and Associates, nothing more." "Good call," James agreed. "But the scrutiny won't stop there. They're combing through your real estate stakes, the tech funds, every board you sit on. They're seeing Elizabeth Winters and Elizabeth Matthews as one woman now." I sank into an armchair, my gaze drifting over the city. "They're not wrong," I murmured. "I'd never hidden to deceive, only to shield the parts of my life that thrive best apart. But walls this thin collapse easily under prying eyes. I want Clara Mason on this." I said it with finality. Clara's mastery at diffusing crises, or more accurately, taming narrative chaos, was unmatched. Set it up this afternoon and reach out to every major board. I'll speak to them directly. Assure them the ground under their feet hasn't shifted. "Understood," James said. His calm was the perfect counterweight to my own tightening resolve. When we hung up, I dialed Meredith Sloan, sharp, loyal Meredith, whose courtroom maneuvers had turned Richard's smug certainty to ash in under an hour. "It was my pleasure," she said, her voice warm with victory. "Though I'd pay good money to relive Richard's face when your ownership files hit the table." I laughed, an unrestrained sound that startled even me. He looked like he'd swallowed a wasp. "Have you seen the legal blogs?" Meredith asked, unable to keep the amusement from her tone. "You're the darling of the morning news cycle. The woman who owned the empire and never lifted a finger to meddle. The ethical shadow queen." I pinched the bridge of my nose, half exasperated, half grateful. If my business is going to be gossip, at least let it be about my ethics. We shared a conspiratorial silence before I turned to the next task. Marcus Weber answered on the first ring, his tone as taut as piano wire. "Elizabeth, my phone hasn't stopped. The partners are rattled. Leadership, stability. There's fear of the unknown." "Nothing has changed, Marcus," I reminded him, my voice now edged with the steel that had built my hidden legacy. "I've owned Caldwell and Associates for 9 years. We thrived because I stayed where I belong. At the helm, not on the deck." "That remains true, I know," he said, hesitant. "But they need to hear it from you, in person. It will calm the undercurrents." I let out a slow breath. Of course. Lawyers, a tribe fluent in risk but terrified of its whispers. "Arrange it. Tomorrow morning. Understood." When we ended the call, I flipped open my notebook and let the pen move. Clear, deliberate bullet points about continuity, trust, the walls that would not crack now that names were stitched together for the world to see. A soft buzz interrupted my thoughts. Diane's name blinking across the screen. "Lunch today, and don't you dare keep the best parts to yourself." I couldn't help it. I smiled, a warm bloom in the sterile luxury of the suite. Some things, like Diane's blunt loyalty, needed no reinvention. And as I looked out at the awakening city, I knew tomorrow would be mine. But today I would savor reclaiming every piece of the self. I slipped the phone into my handbag and exhaled slowly, letting the finality of my own text settle like dust in a sunbeam. It was time. My place. For too long, that house had felt like an echo of someone else's life, a mausoleum of polite lies and gilded silences. But today, draped in the crisp elegance of my charcoal gray Armani suit and the delicate glint of pearl at my ears, I resolved to reclaim every inch of it. As I fastened my watch, Richard's parting words unfurled again in my mind. What will you do now? A question deceptively mundane yet brimming with the unspoken, as if he himself suspected the answer might make him irrelevant. I'd lived so long partitioned like a puzzle box. Elizabeth Winters, the calculating architect of profitable ventures, and Elizabeth Matthews, the gracious wife who'd buried her sharper instincts beneath a veneer of domestic ease. I'd wielded both names as shields, never daring to merge them. But now the masquerade was obsolete. Perhaps this entire ordeal, betrayal, settlement, whispered pity, was not a ruin but a threshold. I could be both the woman who protected Richard's ego and the strategist who needed no man's permission to build empires. I gathered my notes, slipped my laptop into its sleeve, and felt the question transform in my chest. No longer what will I do, but what won't I? When I stepped into Caldwell and Associates' boardroom, a hush swept through the polished expanse like a gust through tall grass. 14 partners surrounded the vast mahogany table. 13 men, 1 woman, and every pair of eyes flicked to me, measuring and recalculating. Marcus Weber, mid-sentence at the head, cut himself off, surprise flickering across his practiced composure. "Elizabeth," he said, catching himself, "thank you for joining us. I was just briefing everyone on yesterday's developments." I acknowledged him with a nod, but ignored the empty chair he indicated. I would not be boxed in, not by furniture, not by precedent. Remaining on my feet, I surveyed the faces that had once known me only as a gracious hostess, a topic for benign gossip. Their polite small talk over catered dinners had never scratched the surface of my influence. Until now. "Good morning," I began, voice calm yet edged like glass. "I appreciate you making time on short notice. I know yesterday's revelation has left you with questions and, perhaps, misgivings. I intend to address them all, unambiguously." A ripple of unease passed through the room, a wave of shifting limbs and a clearing of throats. David Chen, ever Richard's stalwart confidant, leaned forward with the polite aggression of a man who had underestimated me once too often. "With respect, Mrs. Matthews." "Miss Winters," I corrected, a gentle incision that cut deeper than any raised voice. Socially, I used my married name. My business affairs, however, have always borne my own. David faltered but pressed on, driven by the uncomfortable duty of voicing what the others feared to say aloud. "Miss Winters, the partnership is concerned about the conflict your ownership position creates, given your personal relationship with Richard. It could affect governance, trust." "My divorce was finalized yesterday," I said evenly. "My ownership predates it by 9 years. In all that time, it never interfered with firm operations. Why should that change now?" Patricia Reynolds, Caldwell's lone female partner, and one of the few I suspected might see the angles rather than the scandal, raised a brow. Her tone was frank, her curiosity unvarnished. "Because now it's public knowledge. 9 years without disclosure raises questions about transparency, intent." I inclined my head. "Your concern is valid, but legally my stake was never hidden. The corporate paperwork is ironclad. The board of the parent company was fully briefed. I simply chose not to broadcast my role to the operational teams. My choice, not a deception." Patricia's eyes glimmered with a sharp gleam. "A choice driven by your marriage." I let the truth stand uncloaked between us. "At first, yes. When I acquired controlling interest, Richard was still an associate clawing his way to partnership. I refused to have his success stained by whispers of nepotism. Later, it became our unspoken equilibrium. He thrived here, the firm flourished, and I saw no need to disturb what worked." Marcus shifted his weight, voice softer than the others. "And now?" My gaze locked with his, steady, unwavering. "Now the equilibrium shifts. I have no desire to meddle in daily management. My philosophy has always been to invest in strength and let strong leaders lead. Caldwell and Associates remains one of my most valuable holdings for that very reason. The air loosened its grip on the room. Shoulders uncoiled, glances darted between partners like birds startled from a branch. Yet I didn't let them grow too comfortable. However, I continued, allowing the word to hang like a poised blade, the informal boundaries that existed during my marriage to Richard no longer suffice. We must replace them with proper corporate guardrails. Marcus nodded, a flicker of cautious respect beneath his guarded expression. What are you suggesting? First, I said, pacing the head of the table, each step deliberate, we establish a formal reporting channel between the partnership and the holding company's board. Clear information flow, but operational independence remains intact. Second, we conduct a conflict review. Any of my other ventures that could intersect with this firm's clients or interests must be identified and addressed transparently. Third, I paused just long enough to note the discomfort ripple at the edges. Richard's role must be defined with precision. No overlap, no perception of undue influence. The mention of Richard's name stirred the air again. David shifted uncomfortably, his loyalty twisting his features. Richard is one of our top billers. His divorce practice generates considerable revenue. I tilted my chin, letting him see the steel beneath the silk. I am fully aware of Richard's value. My actions here are not driven by petty grievance. He remains an asset if he remains professional. Patricia's eyes flicked to mine, studying me with a mix of admiration and disbelief. You're surprisingly pragmatic about working alongside your ex-husband. A small, knowing smile curved my lips, one that needed no explanation. Business, I said, my voice soft but unyielding, is business. Subtle satisfaction settled in Elizabeth Winter's chest as she lifted her gaze from the conference table, her fingers tapping once against her pen before she caught the faint tremor and stilled it. Personal feelings have no place in investment decisions. She repeated the line inwardly, the words in armor she had learned to wear so well that even Marcus Weber's sudden interjection barely grazed her composure. Speaking of Richard, Marcus said, the edge of weariness in his tone belying it his measured calm, he's requested a brief leave of absence. Given the circumstances, I approved it this morning. Elizabeth registered the revelation in the flicker of an eyelid, no more. Typical Richard, she thought, schooling her features into polite neutrality. That seems reasonable, she said evenly, her voice carrying across the polished oak and etched glass. A cooling-off period might do everyone good. 40 more minutes crawled by. 40 minutes of intricate volleys about corporate governance, voting blocks, reinvestment thresholds. Each question another dart she plucked cleanly from the air and returned with precision. Beneath the sterile hum of the boardroom lights, the atmosphere shifted. Suspicion diluted by the steady drip of her unflappable answers, the fortress walls of old alliances softening into grudging nods. By the time the final slide flickered off the screen, the battle lines had blurred. Partners filed out, stiff postures slackening, some with reluctant respect in their eyes as they offered curt nods her way. Patricia Reynolds lingered, as Elizabeth knew she would. Patricia always rid a room like a chessboard, moving only when the pieces begged to be tipped. That was impressive, Patricia said, her voice low but sharp as a carving knife. She didn't bother with niceties. She never did. You handled a room full of territorial lawyers better than half the federal bench. Elizabeth allowed the corner of her mouth to curve as she gathered her notes into a precise stack. Thank you, though I doubt one good meeting will win them over entirely. Patricia's laugh slipped out, a warm, unvarnished sound that cut through the stale conference room air. Particularly the old guard, they're still grappling with the reality of one female partner, let alone the fact that a woman now owns the entire damn firm. She shook her head, her eyes gleaming with dry amusement. You should have seen some of their faces. Worth every billable hour. Elizabeth's answering smile was quicksilver, real, but gone as swiftly as it arrived. Change unsettles those who cling hardest to the illusion of permanence. Indeed, Patricia's gaze sharpened, dissecting her without malice. By the way, Richard never mentioned you had any business credentials. Always painted you as the gracious wife. Elizabeth lifted a brow, finishing the thought for her. The social organizer, the charity fixture, the quiet support. Something like that, Patricia murmured, her lips quirking into a sly grin. But I always knew there was more. No one arranges dinner seating with that level of psychological warfare unless she's planning far bigger moves. A soft laugh escaped Elizabeth, genuine surprise flickering in her eyes. You noticed? I notice everything, Patricia replied simply. It's how I made partner when no one expected I would. She extended a hand, her grip firm and warm. I look forward to working with you in this new, delightfully visible capacity, Miss Winters. Please call me Elizabeth, she said, feeling an unfamiliar flicker of camaraderie spark in her chest as their hands parted. Patricia slipped away on clicking heels just as Marcus reappeared at the door, his expression loosened by something that might have been relief. He glanced at the now empty seats, then back at her. That went better than expected, he admitted, his tone stripped of its earlier caution. You command a room naturally, took some of them by surprise. Elizabeth closed her folio, her calm now laced with a touch of something sharper. Being underestimated has its uses, Marcus. People reveal themselves when they don't see you coming. He studied her as if seeing something newly cut and polished beneath a familiar surface. All those years you came to firm events as Richard's wife, I never suspected you were studying the operation. I wasn't, not in the way you think. She slid her chair back, the legs whispering against the carpet. My focus has always been on the bigger picture, the firm's worth as a whole. I leave the daily squabbles to people better suited for them. Marcus nodded, reassured, though a ghost of calculation lingered in his eyes. Richard's leave. I trust it wasn't unexpected? It was, she said, gathering her bag with deliberate grace. But sensible. Where did he go? Marcus shrugged, adjusting his cufflinks, suddenly evasive. Didn't say much, just that he needed to recalibrate. His word, not mine. Recalibrate. The word pulsed in her mind like a warning bell, vague enough to placate, crafted just so to spin weakness as strategy. Classic Richard. She wondered fleetingly, coldly, whether Ashley had trailed along in his slipstream. But that chapter had closed, its shadows no longer hers to manage. In the lobby, she walked past the gleaming brass plaque, Richard J. Matthews etched alongside a cluster of other names, an old testament to an old guard that no longer defined her. Stepping through the glass doors, the sunlight caught the tower's mirrored face, and for a breath she saw her reflection. No longer the silent figure beside a powerful man, but the axis around which this polished world now turned. Outside, the driver opened the car door. As the city blurred past the tinted windows, Elizabeth looked back once at Caldwell and Associates, a fortress she had once entered as Richard's appendage. Today she had stepped inside as its sovereign. 3 weeks after the courtroom's final gavel, the last box of Richard's possessions found its way into storage. The house, hers alone now, echoed differently without him. Rooms wider, air clearer, shadows pulled back to reveal colors that had been waiting, patient, for her permission to live. She'd spent an entire weekend reclaiming the spaces, dragging furniture from one corner to another, dismantling frames that housed photographs too loyal to a vanished fiction. In their place, art she adored, jagged lines and bold color that had always been too much for Richard's fragile aesthetic, took pride of place above the mantel. Each nail hammered into the wall felt like an unspoken vow. Piece by piece, she was stitching her name into every corner he had once occupied. Her phone vibrated against the marble counter. Patricia again. Lunch tomorrow. Harrington account. Developments you'll want to hear. A smile ghosted her lips as she typed back. 12:30. Lucian's. Discreet enough for business, far enough to starve the gossip hounds. Perfect. A pause, then another ping. Word is Richard returns tomorrow. Elizabeth stared at the screen, her pulse calm, her thoughts coiling like silk threads drawn through a needle's eye. 3 weeks of silence. No calls, no polite inquiry about the boxes of shirts and cufflinks now gathering dust. He hadn't asked, not through lawyers, not through proxies. He had vanished to rewrite his defeat into something more palatable. Richard Matthews did not disappear. He recalibrated. She tapped back her reply, crisp as frost. Thanks for the heads up. The next dawn, she sat across from Clara Mason at Apex PR, the conference table between them covered in neat printouts of metrics and headlines that no longer screamed her name. Clara's nail tapped a chart with a waning spike of media chatter. The divorce coverage is stale news now, Clara said, satisfaction softening the iron in her voice. Financial rags have found fresher scandals. Elizabeth leaned back, her gaze slipping past the printouts to the glass beyond, where the city pulsed with possibility, a chessboard she now played on her own terms. Relief flickered through me like the first breeze after a storm when Clara leaned in, her tone hushed but steady. Legal blogs are far more interested or funded in your investment maneuvers than the ruins of your marriage. Good, I murmured, my shoulders easing as if some invisible weight slipped free. The less spectacle, the better. Clara, always precise, always unruffled, slid a slender folder across the polished table. The faint rasp of paper on wood was the only sound between us. There is one request pending that you may want to entertain. I flipped the folder open with a flick of my thumb. Williams Business Quarterly. The name alone carried a soft, electric thrill, a recognition of power hidden in plain sight. Their Hidden Forces series. A prestigious piece, Clara affirmed, eyes sharp behind her glasses, and timely. If we shape it correctly, it pivots the narrative, from a wife who quietly owned her husband's firm to a visionary investor with a fortress of diverse assets. The divorce becomes a footnote, not the headline. I let my gaze drift to the rain tapping faintly against the windows behind her. For years, I'd shielded my dealings in deliberate shadow. Elizabeth Winters, the invisible architect, unseen, underestimated. But the veil was thin now, tattered by necessity and betrayal. Perhaps it was time to let them look, so long as they only saw what I wanted them to see. Set it up, I said at last. But I want the questions vetted, and final approval before anything goes to print. Of course, Clara said, crisp as a closing file. When we parted, I left the hush of that meeting room for the gentle hum of Lucian, the restaurant Patricia favored for discreet conversations and unremarkable exits. She was already waiting, perfectly poised in a corner booth, a manila folder propped against her glass like a silent conspirator. The prodigal partner returns, she greeted dryly as I slipped into the seat across from her. Richard? I asked, barely suppressing the flicker of contempt beneath the calm. She smirked, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Fresh tan, new Rolex, a grand re-entrance, naturally. I signaled the waiter for sparkling water, my fingers drumming once on the table's edge. How dramatic was the performance? Patricia's grin was as sharp as the creases in her suit. Measured, if you can believe it. He slipped in early, before the halls filled up. Shut himself behind Marcus Weber's door for nearly an hour. No declarations, no thin apologies. Just business as usual. Tactical, I thought. Textbook Richard. Always calculating the audience before stepping on stage. Let others speculate, test the waters, adjust the mask accordingly, I said aloud. Exactly, Patricia agreed, leaning back as the waiter arrived to take our orders. When he left, she leaned forward again, conspiratorial. Ashley's gone. My brows lifted a fraction. Gone? Resigned last week. She's over at Brenner and Walsh now. Corporate law, not divorce. A neat exit, convenient timing. The paralegal lover quietly vanished, her presence erased from the corridors where gossip lingers. I gave no outward sign of reaction, just the smallest tilt of my head. A fresh start for both, then? Patricia's eyes gleamed with unsaid possibilities. Either she fled or he nudged her out. Either way, the scandal didn't survive the courtroom's glare. I folded my napkin, my voice even. And the partners? Marcus is treating Richard his return like Monday morning paperwork. The rest follow suit, though the younger ones aren't sure how to greet the ex-husband of the firm's owner. It's uncharted territory. A laugh escaped me, quiet, hollow. Elizabeth Winters, shareholder and ghost at the table. Patricia's smile was sympathetic but calculating all the same. She pivoted, opening the manila folder at last, and together we dissected the Harrington account. An elephant of a client poised to consolidate their entire legal business with Caldwell and Associates if we played it precisely. I offered thoughts where needed, guiding her negotiation angles as naturally as exhaling. Our plates emptied, the conversation circled back, inevitable as gravity. Have you spoken to Richard since the hearing? Patricia's tone softened, almost kind, but edged with curiosity. No, I didn't bother dressing the truth. If we need to communicate, Meredith Sloan handles it. The settlement left nothing lingering. Patricia twisted her napkin, choosing her next words with the care of a surgeon's scalpel. He's changed, focused, quieter. Whatever this divorce did to him, maybe it refined him where the rest of us couldn't. A curious observation, but not untrue. Richard always fought his demons by sharpening the blade that was his career. Where emotion failed him, performance saved him. People reveal themselves when they lose what they assumed was theirs forever, I said simply, gathering my things. Back at my tower, my domain in every sense that Caldwell and Associates was not. My assistant met me at the elevator with an armful of messages. The Williams interview is confirmed for next Wednesday at 10, she recited, handing me a slip of paper. And Mr. Sullivan called twice about the tech acquisition. I skimmed the notes, mind already calculating next moves. Anything else? She hesitated, shifting her weight. There was a caller. Wouldn't leave a message, said you'd know. A Mr. Matthews. My pulse skipped, though my face betrayed nothing. When? About an hour ago, said he'd try again. I thanked her with a nod and stepped into my office. The door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing me inside a world I had built stone by stone. Each secret, each share, each betrayal folded neatly into my armor. I hadn't even set my bag down when the phone rang. Miss Winters, my assistant's voice crackled over the intercom, polite but cautious. Richard Matthews is on line 1. Should I? I'll take it, I said before she could finish. Better to face whatever this was now than let it fester. I picked up the receiver, my reflection cold in the darkened window before me. Elizabeth Winters. Elizabeth. His voice slipped through the line. Familiar, composed, that faint authoritative cadence he wielded so easily in courtrooms and conference rooms alike. Thank you for answering. I wasn't sure you would. You have 2 minutes, Richard, I replied, my tone smooth as steel. What is it? He cleared his throat, a sound I recognized too well, a prelude to a performance, though his voice held an edge of something raw beneath the polish. I'd like to meet, in person. There are matters better spoken face to face. The divorce is final, the assets are divided. The house is boxed and listed. What more is there to say? It's not about the divorce, he pressed, insistent but measured. It's about the firm, about how we move forward, professionally, in a way that protects us both. I studied the skyline beyond the glass, my city, my kingdom, too much of it still intertwined with his shadow. To refuse would feel petty, vindictive. 2 traits I'd never allowed anyone to pin on Elizabeth Winters. When and where, I asked, my voice as calm as the dusk settling over the city. Tomorrow evening. A breeze caught the hem of my navy dress as I stepped onto the rooftop terrace of the Archer Hotel. The city skyline ignited by the waning sun like a promise of secrets yet to be spoken. Neutral ground, deliberately chosen. The Archer had never been tainted by the echoes of our marriage, nor entwined with the daily machinations of Caldwell and Associates. It was clean, untouched, a stage befitting this peculiar reunion. Richard Matthews was already there, seated alone at a secluded corner table, his silhouette striking yet softened by the dusk light. He rose when he saw me approach. Familiar lines around his eyes, that same half-smile I'd grown to decipher long ago. And yet, tonight, something elusive flickered beneath it. Less performance, more presence. Elizabeth, he murmured, my name slipping out like a peace offering as he waited for me to settle into my chair. I set my purse down deliberately, my fingers brushing the smooth leather as if to anchor myself. The server hovered. I declined the menu with a slight shake of my head. Sparkling water, lime. You look well, he ventured, though his voice betrayed an undercurrent, one I hadn't heard since the courtroom stripped us bare. 3 weeks adrift on a sailboat will do that, he said, his attempt at levity brushing against the edge of an apology. He nursed a scotch, its amber warmth gleaming in his glass like a confession. The Yad Vasar, Caribbean waters. I needed clarity. I tilted my head, studying him with the same precision I reserved for hostile boardroom negotiations. You never cared for sailing. A college friend's boat, he admitted with a ghost of a shrug. I needed to think, away from Caldwell's marble hallways and the whispers in the legal press. When the server vanished again, I leaned forward, the city lights behind me casting shifting patterns across the tablecloth. So, tell me, Richard, why summon me here under the guise of civility? What is it about the firm that couldn't crawl through the usual channels? He swirled the scotch, watching the liquid catch fire in the sunset. Brenner and Walsh offered me a partnership. I let the silence stretch, a silk ribbon pulled taut. Brenner and Walsh, rivals, well-heeled, perpetually snapping at Caldwell's wine flanks, but lacking its old money legacy. Unexpected, I said evenly, masking my curiosity behind immaculate poise. I didn't think they'd court someone so entrenched. They approached me while I was gone, he explained, voice careful, edges smoothed by necessity. Their divorce practice is fractured. They want me to rebuild it, handsomely. A low laugh almost escaped me, but I swallowed it, folding my hands instead. And you're telling me this because? Because it puts us on opposite sides, Elizabeth. His gaze met mine, clear, steady, unshielded for once. And given our history, given you own Caldwell, I wanted to be certain there'd be no complications. I arched an eyebrow, allowing the disbelief to play freely across my face. You mean retaliation? You think I'd wield my ownership like a cudgel? Undercut your shiny new partnership? He had the decency to look discomfited, just a flicker, quickly concealed. Not exactly. I know you better than that, but the optics are delicate. I traced a drop of condensation down my glass, feeling the weight of his words settle into the quiet space between us. Richard, my stake in Caldwell was never about you, or us. Business is business. My divorce didn't change that, nor will your career detour. Relief flickered across his face, genuine, if fleeting. The mask slipped again when he leaned back, letting the city's gold glow warm his features. Thank you. I needed to hear it. I nodded, but my curiosity pressed on, refusing to fade. Then why go at all? 12 years carving your name into Caldwell's brass plate. You'll be tearing that all down to build again from scratch. He twirled the scotch, eyes lost in its shallow amber pool. Because the money's good. But more than that, it's a cleaner break. For both of us. I heard the truth under the polish. How staying would mean every boardroom triumph judged against the shadow of my signature on the firm's founding documents. Every misstep pinned to whispers of a failed marriage lingering in the conference room. That's thoughtful, I allowed, watching him watch me, though unnecessary. Perhaps, he said, that quiet edge back in his voice, softer than I'd heard in years. But these weeks alone, salt air, no watchful eyes, they made me see it clearer. I don't want us tangled together out of habit and paperwork. I think some distance will serve us. There was honesty there, raw, unvarnished. A glimpse of Richard. I'd rarely glimpsed, even in our most intimate moments, the man behind the arguments, and the infidelities, and the careful press statements. If that's what you want, I said finally, then you have my blessing. My silence too. He nodded, gratitude flickering behind the lawyer's mask, but he didn't let it rest. One more thing, I raised an eyebrow, almost amused. There's always one more thing. He laughed, the sound roughened by something that might have been regret. I owe you an apology, a real one, not the polished line my attorney drafted for court. I stayed silent, the hum of city life far below the only witness as he gathered his courage. For years, he said slowly, I thought I had you figured out, the perfect boxes, the roles, the expectations. I never asked what lay beneath all that. I didn't want to see it, didn't know how. And that blindness cost me far more than I understood until now. I held his gaze, steady and unwavering. His confession was unrehearsed, raw enough that for a heartbeat I almost mourned the man he'd pretended to be. Thank you for saying that, I said, my voice softer than I intended. But I wasn't blameless. I built walls you didn't even know were there. Kept pieces of myself separate, secret. His eyes narrowed, curiosity ignited by the very distance he'd once taken for granted. What he sees you, he asked, the question honest, an open door to a past too tangled to unlock in one rooftop confession. The city lights pulsed between us, possibility, regret, finality, threaded through the golden dusk as the skyline kept our secrets safe. I swallowed the knot of regret lodged in my throat and held Richard's gaze steady. At first, I kept it from you to protect your pride, I confessed, my voice quieter than the hush settling between us. Later, it became routine, like muscle memory I never questioned. And eventually, I paused, searching the dark rooftop skyline for the right shape of honesty. Eventually, it turned into a test. I wondered if you'd ever care enough to truly see me, to ask the questions that mattered, to peer through the polished facade you always preferred. Recognition flickered in Richard's eyes, a slow burn of comprehension, equal parts regret and surrender. A test I've failed spectacularly, he murmured, the corners of his mouth tightening in something that wasn't quite a smile. We both failed, I allowed, breathing out the words with a softness that held no bitterness now. Failed to speak, failed to grow together instead of drifting further apart. The confession drifted into the night air and settled between us like a fragile bridge, imperfect but enough to cross the years of silence. Richard leaned back against the railing, the lights of the city beginning their evening dance below. For what it's worth, he said at last, voice low, I'm sorry about Ashley. Bringing her to the courthouse. God, that was petty, unprofessional. It was. I didn't flinch at the memory, just met his admission head on. But in an odd, backward way, I should thank you for it. If you hadn't been so determined to humiliate me that day, I might have gone on letting you underestimate me forever. A wry, strangled laugh escaped him. He shook his head as if he could dislodge the irony. The great Richard Matthews, undone by the wife he never really bothered to know. Ex-wife, I corrected softly, letting the word stand firm and final between us, echoing the cold marble of that courthouse hallway. Ex-wife, he repeated, mouth twisting into a reluctant grin. Though still a formidable opponent, it seems. As the skyline deepened into cobalt and the hum of traffic below took on a softer edge, I realized our conversation had outlived the strict half-hour I'd allowed for this meeting. To my surprise, I felt no urge to glance at my watch. This unvarnished reckoning, was worth the time. It was the closure we'd both pretended we didn't need. I should go. To hum, I said, finally collecting my purse from where it rested on the table. I stood, feeling the night air wrap itself around my shoulders like a promise. Good luck at Brenner and Walsh, if that's where you land. Richard rose too, smoothing invisible creases from his jacket. And I wish you every success with that profile in Williams Business Quarterly, he said, his tone carrying a faint note of wonder. Marcus mentioned it. Did he? I blinked, momentarily thrown by the thought of Marcus Weber, of all people, discussing my name in a context other than corporate maneuvering. Well, thank you. We lingered at the edge of parting, the space between us heavy with things no longer needing to be said. Then Richard extended his hand, awkward, almost boyish, but undeniably sincere. To new beginnings. I slipped my hand into his. The shake was firm, the gesture strangely fitting, like two seasoned rivals saluting across the battlefield that had once been our marriage. To new beginnings. When I stepped into the elevator, I left behind the rooftop's gleaming bar and its half-finished glasses. But the weight that had clung to my shoulders for so many years did not follow me down. As the lobby lights spilled golden across polished marble, I knew without any grand epiphany that I was lighter now, untethered at last from the shadows of what we'd been. Richard Matthews and I would never trade holiday cards or reminisce over coffee. We would never be friends in any soft, domestic sense of the word. But there was value, unexpected, precious value, in this hard-earned civility, in this grudging respect forged from the ruins. 12 months later, I stood in my office at Winter's Investment Group. The city stretched, glittering beyond my floor-to-ceiling windows, like a living testament to what could be built when one stopped asking for permission. If I craned my neck just so I could glimpse the sleek glass tower housing Caldwell and Associates, my past life's fortress, still under my steady thumb, The annual report proofs lay crisp and meticulous before me. After years spent cloaking my empire in a maze of shell corporations and discrete holdings, I'd consolidated everything under one audacious banner: Winters Investment Group. Public now, accountable now, and unmistakably Pine. The Williams Business Quarterly spread had been a quiet, seismic shift. Gone was the ghost of Richard Matthews's convenient wife. In her place, Elizabeth Winters, strategist and architect, the woman who'd spun secrets into capital and capital into power. My phone pulsed with a text. Patricia Reynolds, now managing partner at Caldwell, installed after Marcus Weber's graceful exit 3 months back. Numbers are stellar. Expansion vote was unanimous. Dinner next week? I typed back, count me in. Patricia's ascent had been my final chess move in a year of checkmates, earned not because she was the firm's token female, but because she was the sharpest blade in that arsenal. The firm thrived under her, and in turn, so did I. A knock at the door snapped me back. Sarah, efficient and warm as ever, stood poised in the doorway. "Miss Winters, the Thompson Group delegation is here." "Perfect. Show them in, please." As I gathered my notes, my eyes caught on the framed Williams Business Quarterly cover. My own face, my own headline: Elizabeth Winters, the strategist who built an empire in plain sight. The memory of that photo shoot still made me smile. A portrait not of Richard's wife in some glittering gown, but of a woman entirely her own. The meeting unfolded smoothly, another acquisition lined up like a piece waiting to be claimed. When the Thompson executives departed, Sarah reappeared with a fresh briefing. "The real estate closing is at 2, then you're meeting Diane for coffee at 4. I nodded. Diane, steadfast Diane, my mirror, my compass. I would welcome her blunt truths and her laughter, reminders of who I'd been and how far I'd come. As I slid my files into my bag, the skyline beyond my window glowed like a promise made flesh. For the first time in years, tomorrow did not feel like an echo of yesterday. It felt wide open, waiting to be shaped by my own unflinching hands.